A billionaire CEO thought he had everything, until a little girl called him Dad in the cereal aisle. Henry Blake had built an empire with little more than his ambition, his discipline, and an unshakable sense of control. As the CEO of one of the largest construction firms in the country, he was the type of man who arrived at the office before dawn and often left well after sunset, his world governed by numbers, deadlines, and silent elevators that took him to the top floor of glass buildings he had designed. But that afternoon, something felt different. The air was heavy, and the day's meetings had left him with a dull ache behind his eyes. Instead of calling for his driver, he decided to walk for a moment, just down the path behind his building, through the public park he'd helped fund years ago. The trees whispered in the early fall breeze, and a few golden leaves swirled past his polished shoes. He adjusted the cuffs of his dark blue suit and loosened his tie just slightly. That's when he saw her. A flash of light pink darted across the path ahead, small, quick, like a startled animal, and disappeared behind one of the large oaks that lined the edge of the walking trail. Curious, Henry slowed his steps. He heard a soft, choked sound. As he came closer, he realized it was crying. Behind the tree, crouched low to the ground, was a little girl. She looked no older than 5, dressed in a pale pink dress that had patches of dirt on the hem. Her brown hair was pulled up into a loose bun, already starting to fall apart, and her little hands were pressed against her eyes as her shoulders shook. Something inside Henry twisted unexpectedly. He hadn't been around children in years, didn't really know what to do with them, but the sight of this tiny, heartbroken child stirred something long buried. He crouched down slowly, keeping his voice soft. "Hey, are you okay?" She flinched at first, then peeked out from behind her hands. Her eyes were big, brown, and filled with tears. She didn't speak right away, but when she did, her voice was barely a whisper. "Everyone has a daddy," she said. "But I only have a mommy. I don't want a mommy." Henry was stunned by the raw sadness in her tone. Before he could respond, he heard a voice, louder now, panicked and calling out. "Emmy! Emmy!" The woman's voice was cracking, breathless. She was clearly searching for the child. Henry looked back at the little girl and something in him rebelled at the thought of handing her off without a word. He didn't know why, but his heart ached. Then, without thinking, he said the words that would change everything. "How about this? Just for today. I'll be your dad." She stared at him. Her crying slowed. For a moment, she just looked at him as if trying to figure out whether he meant it. Then, quietly, she reached out her small hand. Henry took it. Together, they stood up. And as he turned toward the direction of the woman's voice, Henry realized that he had just made a promise he didn't fully understand, but had no intention of breaking. Kate Harper was nearly hysterical by the time she spotted her daughter. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight from running and panic, and her eyes scanned the park with increasing desperation. Emmy had vanished just minutes earlier after another long, painful conversation about school, about how the other kids had dads who came to events and brought them to birthday parties, while Emmy had no one but her mother. Kate had tried to explain again, gently and patiently, that some families looked different, that love mattered more than roles or appearances. But Emmy wasn't having it. She had yanked her hand away and taken off across the sidewalk before Kate could stop her. And now, as Kate pushed through a row of trees and turned a corner near the playground, she froze. Emmy was there, safe, but not alone. A tall man in a tailored suit knelt beside her, holding her hand. Kate's first instinct was fear. Who was this stranger? Her voice came out sharp, cracking as she called out, "Emmy." Her daughter turned at the sound and smiled, a surprising expression of relief and trust that caught Kate completely off guard. The man stood up, his hands visible, and gently guided Emmy toward her. "She's all right," he said calmly, almost cautiously. "She was just upset." Kate ran forward and wrapped Emmy in her arms before lifting her gaze to the man's face. She froze again. He looked familiar. His face was sharp, clean-cut, undeniably handsome, with striking blue eyes and thick dark hair. It took her a moment to place him, not from her life, but from magazines, interviews, local business coverage. He was Henry Blake, CEO of Blake & Grayson, a man whose wealth was often discussed alongside his coldness. She'd seen headlines about billion-dollar projects and cold negotiations, nothing that ever hinted at him holding a child's hand in a public park. "I'm sorry if she caused trouble," Kate said quickly, still clutching Emmy close. She ran off during an argument. She's been going through something lately." "She didn't cause any trouble," Henry said, his voice softer than she'd expected. "Actually, she helped me remember something important." Kate raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond to that. Emmy looked up at her and whispered, "He said he'll be my daddy today." Kate stiffened. She stared at Henry, unsure whether to be offended or grateful, not knowing if this was some kind of cruel joke or a kind gesture taken too far. But when she looked at him again, she saw something different, something unguarded. He wasn't joking. He looked just as surprised at his own words as she was. "I meant it," he said, sensing her discomfort. "I didn't know what else to say." She looked so heartbroken. "And I've never seen anyone cry like that and not want to fix it." Kate hesitated. Part of her wanted to take Emmy and walk away as fast as she could. But the other part, the tired, worn part of her that had worked 3 jobs, fought off loneliness, and watched her daughter suffer in silence, was curious. Why had a man like him, who clearly had no reason to stop for anyone, decided to help? "I was going to take her home," Kate said cautiously. "We live nearby." Henry nodded, then glanced at his watch. "Let me drive you. It's the least I can do." She hesitated again but ultimately agreed. Emmy was already tugging on his hand, clearly enjoying the attention. They walked to his car together, and Kate tried not to feel small as she stepped into a luxury vehicle more expensive than her entire apartment. Henry adjusted the rearview mirror and asked Emmy simple questions on the way: what her favorite color was, whether she liked animals, what cartoons she watched. Kate was stunned by how naturally he spoke to her, like someone who had done this before, even though his world screamed childless bachelor. When they reached her modest apartment building, Kate started to open the door but paused. "Thank you," she said, unsure of what she even meant. For not calling the police. For not judging. For making her daughter feel seen for one day. "I meant it," Henry repeated, meeting her eyes. "Just today, I wanted to be someone she could count on." Kate nodded slowly. Then, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. "Maybe you already were." The next morning felt different, both for Henry and for Emmy. For him, the memory of the little girl's trembling voice and the grip of her tiny hand had followed him home and into the night, lingering even as he tried to drown it out with his usual late-night work routine. But nothing worked. The spreadsheet he'd stared at for an hour remained blurry. The emails went unanswered. And the bourbon in his glass tasted like guilt. He couldn't forget how she said it: "Everyone has a daddy, but I only have a mommy." Those words cracked something inside him that he hadn't realized was even there. So when dawn came, instead of diving into business calls and meetings, he picked up his phone and sent a message to his driver with a new address and an unusual request: prepare the car seat. Meanwhile, Emmy had woken up unusually early and sat at the edge of her bed, her pink pajamas wrinkled from sleep. Her mother, Kate, was already up, preparing her usual black coffee and mentally organizing the day: calls to return from work, rent due at the end of the week, and the meeting with Emmy's school counselor about the bullying that she still hadn't found the strength to attend. But Emmy was quiet. Not anxious, not angry. Just quiet. Kate noticed it right away. "Emmy, honey. Everything okay?" she asked gently. The girl shrugged, but her eyes were hopeful. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked after a moment. Kate paused, knowing exactly who he was. I think he did, she said softly, because somehow, despite all her instincts, she believed it too. An hour later, a sleek black car pulled up outside their apartment building. Kate peeked through the blinds, unsure whether to feel wary or warned. When she opened the door, Henry stood there, not in a suit this time, but in a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, his hair slightly wind-tossed, and a cautious expression on his face. "I was wondering," he said, almost shyly, "if Emmy might like a ride to school. If it's okay with you." Kate blinked, stunned. "You came back." "I couldn't stop thinking about her," he admitted. "Or you. I know I said, just for a day, but maybe it doesn't have to end there." Kate studied his face. It was disarming how honest he looked, how human. Against her usual guarded nature, she nodded. "All right. But I'm coming with you." Henry smiled, visibly relieved, and helped Emmy into the back seat, buckling her seatbelt with the care of someone who'd never done it before but wanted to get it right. Emmy giggled and held on to his arm a moment longer than needed, as if afraid he might disappear. When they arrived at school, Emmy seemed transformed. She walked a little taller, clutching Henry's hand. The other children stared. Some whispered. A few teachers gave uncertain looks, recognizing Henry immediately from local headlines and business news. But he ignored them. He knelt next to Emmy, straightened her backpack strap, and said quietly, "You've got this." Then Emmy turned to a group of girls who usually mocked her during pickup and drop-off, and, for the first time, didn't look away. She simply said, "This is my dad. He came today." It didn't matter whether it was literal or not. At that moment, it was true enough. Henry walked Kate back to the car, both of them silent for a few moments. She finally said, "I haven't seen her like that in months." "She's stronger than most adults I know," he replied. "So are you." Kate laughed bitterly. "Strong is just what you become when there's no other choice." "I used to think success was the same as strength," he said thoughtfully. But she changed that in 5 minutes. The conversation lingered as they drove back to her place. When they arrived, Kate hesitated, then asked the question that had been hovering between them since yesterday. "Why are you doing this?" Henry didn't deflect. "I don't know yet. But it feels like the first thing that makes sense in a long time." Kate nodded. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a plan. But it was real. And that was more than she'd expected from anyone, especially someone like him. Kate stood at the window, watching the black car pull away with a strange heaviness in her chest that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't worry exactly, nor was it excitement. It was a fragile mixture of both. She hadn't expected Henry to return, much less offer to take Emmy to school like he'd done it 100 times before. That kind of gesture from a man like him didn't make sense in her world. Men didn't stay. Men didn't offer rides just to be kind. They didn't bring warmth into small apartments or gently adjust the straps of tiny backpacks. And yet, he had done all of that without a trace of obligation. She kept wondering when the catch would come, when the mask would fall. But it hadn't. Not yet. Later that day, after finishing her shift at the diner, Kate picked Emmy up from school as usual. Her daughter came running out of the building, her face brighter than it had been in weeks. There was a confidence in her step, an ease in her shoulders that Kate hadn't seen in months. Emmy climbed into the car and immediately began talking, not about math or recess like she used to, but about how Mr. Henry had helped her carry her backpack and how the other kids didn't tease her today. She said it so casually, like it was already becoming normal. That night, Kate lay awake in bed long after Emmy had fallen asleep. She couldn't stop thinking about how quickly one man had shifted their entire routine. She had spent years building careful walls, not because she didn't want help, but because hope had always come with disappointment attached. But now, Henry was somehow pushing through those barriers without demanding anything in return. And it scared her. The next morning, there was a knock at the door before she even finished her coffee. She opened it to find Henry holding a paper bag and 2 coffees. He raised it slightly and offered a sheepish smile. "I figured it was my turn to bring breakfast." She let him in, surprised again by how naturally he fit into their space. He sat at the kitchen table with Emmy while Kate prepared her things for work. At one point, Kate stood in the hallway and listened to them talking. Emmy was asking him if he ever played games as a kid, and Henry was trying to explain how he once built a treehouse that collapsed the first time he climbed into it. Emmy giggled uncontrollably, and Kate had to cover her mouth to keep from laughing too. After Emmy left for school with Henry again, Kate found herself staring at the empty apartment, unsettled by the quiet. She hadn't realized how quickly she'd grown used to his presence, how quickly her daughter had lit up under his attention. Later that evening, when Henry brought Emmy home, he lingered at the door for a moment, clearly unsure if he should come in or not. Kate nodded, and they sat together while Emmy drew pictures on the floor. "I hope I'm not overstepping," Henry said after a while. "I know this isn't normal." Kate sipped her tea and looked at him carefully. "It's not. But nothing about life ever is." They sat in silence for a bit. Then he added, "I don't want to confuse her. Or you. But I can't pretend like this doesn't feel important." Kate looked down at her hands, fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. "You're not confusing her," she said quietly. "You're showing her what it feels like to be chosen." Those words hung between them, neither daring to say more. Henry eventually stood to leave, and as he opened the door, Kate surprised herself by saying, "You can stay for dinner tomorrow, if you want." He turned, a flicker of hope in his expression. "I'd like that." After he left, Kate sat alone in the quiet, heart pounding. She still didn't know where this was going. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. The following evening, Kate found herself pacing in the kitchen more times than she cared to count. She wasn't exactly nervous, but she wasn't calm either. It had been years since anyone came to dinner, not family, not friends, and certainly not a man. The apartment, though small, was clean and filled with quiet energy, the kind that comes when something unfamiliar is about to enter a familiar space. Emmy was in her room, humming while she drew a picture, completely unaware of the internal storm brewing in her mother's chest. To her, Henry coming for dinner wasn't a big deal. It already felt natural. Kate had spent most of the afternoon cooking, preparing a simple meal that didn't try too hard but still showed effort. It wasn't about impressing him, she told herself, but about acknowledging that he mattered enough to feed. She glanced at the clock again, just as a knock echoed through the apartment. She opened the door and there he was, Henry Blake in a dark button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, holding a small bouquet of white daisies. He smiled, a bit awkward, and offered them to her without a word. "They're not much," he said finally, "but Emmy said you liked flowers." Kate took them with a quiet smile. "She's right." He stepped inside, and for a few seconds, neither of them knew what to say. But then Emmy came running into the room and wrapped her arms around his legs like she had known him forever. He bent down to lift her easily and she immediately began telling him about the picture she drew and how she named the dog in her drawing, Mr. Barkley. Kate watched them, amazed by how easily her daughter trusted this man, how safe she looked when she was near him. They ate dinner together at the small round table near the window. The conversation wasn't deep or dramatic, but it was real. Henry told them about a dog he had when he was little, and Kate shared a story about the time Emmy tried to bake muffins using salt instead of sugar. Laughter came easily, which surprised Kate more than anything. It had been a long time since the sound of her own laughter hadn't felt forced. Henry asked her questions, not just polite ones, but real ones, the kind that people asked when they actually wanted to know. She told him about her job, about how she used to paint before life got too heavy, about the way she and Emmy sometimes danced in the living room to old music on Friday nights. After dinner, Emmy begged for 5 more minutes before bedtime, which turned into 15, and somehow Henry ended up on the floor helping her finish her drawing. Kate sat back, observing the two of them together. There was something deeply human about the way he interacted with her daughter, no patronizing tone, no pretending. Just quiet, steady attention. And it wasn't lost on her that he wasn't doing it to win favor or impress anyone. He looked like he needed it just as much as Emmy did. When it was finally time to say goodnight, Henry carried Emmy to her room and tucked her in like he had done it 100 times. Kate stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching with a strange ache in her chest. Emmy looked up at him and whispered, "You can come back tomorrow, right?" Henry looked at Kate before answering. She nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'd like that." After Emmy fell asleep, they returned to the kitchen. Kate poured 2 cups of tea, and they sat in silence for a moment. Finally, she asked, "Why do you keep coming back?" Henry stared into his tea. "Because when I leave, I don't feel right. And when I'm here, I feel something I haven't felt in years." Kate didn't ask what that something was. She didn't need to. She understood it. The aching familiarity of being needed. Of having someone look at you like you're part of something bigger than yourself. She didn't know what it meant, or where it was going, but she also didn't stop him when he reached across the table and took her hand. There was no grand confession, no kiss under the light. Just warmth. A beginning. And for the first time in a long, long while, Kate let herself feel it. In the weeks that followed, Henry's presence in their lives shifted from occasional to consistent in a way that surprised everyone, including him. What began as an unplanned act of compassion had grown into something steadier, something almost routine. He started coming by a few evenings each week, always with a small gift for Emmy, a coloring book, a puzzle, a pack of her favorite stickers, but never anything extravagant. Kate noticed how careful he was not to overwhelm them, not to cross lines, not to assume a role that hadn't been officially given. And yet, somehow, he was already part of their rhythm. He helped Emmy with her spelling, read her bedtime stories, and stayed just long enough to drink tea with Kate before heading home. Sometimes they would talk, other times they would sit in silence. It was never awkward. For Henry, the transition was strange and strangely natural. He had never imagined himself in a home like this, modest, cluttered with toys, filled with laughter one moment and quiet the next. His penthouse had always felt more like a showroom than a place for living. But here, in Kate's apartment, he found comfort in the chipped mugs, the scent of old lavender in the hallway, and the way Emmy's drawings were taped to the fridge with crooked magnets. It felt alive in a way that nothing in his world had felt for years. One evening, as Emmy was brushing her teeth, Henry sat across from Kate on the couch. She looked tired, not from him, but from life. She rubbed her eyes and let out a sigh. "I didn't think this would happen," she said quietly. "Any of it." He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Neither did I." Kate looked at him. "You know this isn't a game. She's 5. She loves easily, but she breaks just as fast." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not going anywhere." The words were simple, but they landed with weight. Kate didn't respond right away, but her silence wasn't rejection. It was absorption. She was letting the idea settle, trying to believe it. And in her silence, Henry found the strength to continue. "I used to think success was about numbers, titles, winning. But the truth is, I didn't know what I was missing until I met her. Until I met both of you." Later that night, after Emmy had gone to sleep, Henry stayed a little longer than usual. Kate sat curled up in her chair, wrapped in a thin blanket, and he leaned back against the wall beside her. They didn't touch, didn't move closer. But the closeness was still there, building in the quiet. The next day, Henry made a phone call that felt like crossing a personal boundary. He contacted a therapist, not for himself, but for Emmy. He had started noticing the way her eyes would shift whenever someone mentioned school. The confidence she'd shown on the day of the parent event had begun to fade again. Kate had already seen it too. She admitted it over coffee, the bullying hadn't stopped, it had just gone quiet. When the therapist agreed to see Emmy the following week, Henry offered to take her. Kate looked uncertain at first, but eventually said yes. He picked Emmy up early from school, took her for ice cream, and then brought her to the office. She was quiet in the beginning, but when they left, she clung to his hand and said, "The lady said it's okay to be sad sometimes. That doesn't mean I'm broken." Henry crouched beside her and said, "You're not broken at all. You're one of the strongest people I know." That night, Emmy drew a picture of 3 people holding hands under a big yellow sun. She labeled them carefully, me, Mom, and H. It was the first time she'd included him in one of her drawings. Kate found the picture taped to the fridge the next morning. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters with her fingers. Then she turned to find Henry already sitting at the table, sipping his coffee. She walked over, sat across from him, and simply said, "You're becoming home to her. And maybe to me, too." He didn't smile, didn't joke. He only nodded and replied, "Then I'll build a foundation that won't ever crack." The first time Emmy called him Dad, it wasn't dramatic or planned. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon while they were grocery shopping. Henry had picked her up from school because Kate was stuck covering someone else's shift at the diner, and they had stopped by the store on the way home. Emmy was seated in the cart, swinging her legs and humming as he pushed it down the cereal aisle. She pointed at a box with a cartoon tiger on it and asked, "Can we get this one, Dad?" The word slipped out of her mouth so naturally that neither of them realized it at first. But Henry stopped pushing. Emmy looked up at him with wide eyes, suddenly aware of what she'd said. She opened her mouth, ready to apologize, but he knelt beside the cart and said gently, "Say it again." She hesitated. "Dad?" He nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah. That's okay." He didn't cry, but something inside him cracked and filled all at once. He had never heard that word addressed to him in his life, and now that it had happened, he knew there was no going back. Emmy didn't need to apologize. She had spoken from her heart, and he was ready to receive it. That night, he told Kate what had happened. She was sitting at the kitchen table folding laundry when he walked in, and the moment he shared the story, she froze with a small shirt in her hands. Her face went blank for a moment, as if she wasn't sure whether to be terrified or relieved. Then she exhaled and quietly said, "I wondered when it would happen." He sat across from her, elbows on the table. "I didn't prompt it. I wouldn't have pushed her like that." "I know," she said. "That's why it means something." They sat in silence for a while, the air thick with something deeper than conversation. Kate was scared, and Henry understood why. This wasn't just about feelings anymore. It was about permanence. It was about what happened when a little girl believed in someone so deeply that she gave him the title that had always been missing from her life. Later that week, Henry began the process of legally adopting Emmy. He didn't want to pressure Kate, so he brought it up with care, giving her all the space she needed to say no. But instead of refusing, Kate listened. She asked hard questions. She made him prove his consistency. And eventually, when all her doubts had been worn down by weeks of showing up, by midnight stories, by little lunches packed with care, by evenings spent fixing broken toys and braiding dolls' hair, she agreed. The legal process was long and filled with red tape. Background checks, interviews, forms that asked intimate questions about Henry's past, his finances, his home. He answered them all. His assistant, who had been managing billion-dollar contracts for years, now helped organize papers for a little girl who loved jelly beans and named clouds. Henry's priorities had shifted, and everyone around him noticed. His employees saw him smiling more, arriving later but leaving earlier. His board of directors asked if he was planning to step back, and he simply told them he was stepping into something more important. One evening, a social worker came to their home for a visit. Emmy was wearing a yellow dress and held Henry's hand the entire time. The woman asked routine questions: what they did together, how they handled bedtime, what Emmy liked most about him. Emmy answered with surprising clarity for her age. "He listens to me. And he stays. I like that he stays." That one sentence was more powerful than any document Henry had submitted. Kate watched from the kitchen, arms folded tightly across her chest, trying not to cry. After the visit, the approval was granted. Henry would officially become Emmy's father within weeks. The news didn't come with fanfare or confetti, just a quiet email and a scheduled court date. But to them, it felt like a miracle. Kate didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch, staring at the living room Emmy had turned into a makeshift playground of paper crowns and mismatched socks. When Henry found her there at dawn, she whispered, "I never imagined someone would choose us." He sat beside her and rested his hand over hers. "You weren't waiting to be chosen. You were always enough. I just finally saw it." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The silence was full of understanding, and the morning light coming through the blinds felt softer than usual. For the first time in her adult life, Kate didn't feel like she had to fight to hold her world together. Someone was finally holding it with her. The morning of the court date arrived with an odd quiet. The kind that settles before a life-changing moment, where even the smallest sounds feel heavier than usual. Kate stood in the hallway of their apartment, smoothing the collar of her blouse while glancing into Emmy's room. The little girl was sitting on her bed, carefully adjusting a clip in her hair shaped like a silver star. She had picked out her dress all by herself, a pale blue one with tiny white flowers, and even insisted on wearing her shiny shoes, the ones she normally saved for birthdays or picture day. Kate felt a lump in her throat as she watched her daughter hum softly to herself, seemingly unaware of just how big this day really was. Henry arrived right on time, dressed in a charcoal suit with no tie, just as Emmy had requested. She had told him ties made him look too serious and that today should be a happy day. He smiled when he saw her, kneeling down to her level as she threw her arms around his neck. For a moment, Kate watched them from the doorway and tried to memorize the image, the way Emmy's little hands rested on his shoulders, the way Henry held her as if he'd been doing it forever. When he stood, he looked at Kate and said quietly, "Ready?" She nodded, but the truth was, she didn't feel ready at all. Not because she had doubts, those had melted away long ago, but because something about finalizing this chapter made her emotional in a way she hadn't expected. She had fought so hard to keep her daughter safe, to build a life out of almost nothing, and now that help had finally arrived, it felt overwhelming to let go of the part of her that had grown used to doing it all alone. At the courthouse, they sat side by side on a wooden bench outside the courtroom doors. The hallway was sterile and echoing, filled with others waiting for their own stories to be heard. Emmy swung her legs back and forth and leaned against Henry's arm, unbothered by the stiffness of the room. She looked up at him and asked, "Will it be like a wedding?" Henry chuckled softly. "Sort of," he replied. "Just fewer flowers and more paperwork." "But I still get to keep you?" she asked. "You'll never lose me," he said without hesitation. When they were called in, Kate held Emmy's hand while Henry walked beside them. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes and a steady voice, asked a series of routine questions. She reviewed the paperwork, addressed Kate, then turned to Henry and asked him the one question that made time seem to slow. "Do you understand the responsibilities of legal guardianship and the commitment you are making today?" Henry straightened slightly and replied, "I do. With all of me." The judge nodded. Then she turned to Emmy, who was seated on a small chair in front of the bench, swinging her legs and wearing a nervous smile. "And what do you think of Mr. Blake?" the judge asked gently. Emmy beamed. "He's my dad," she said. "I picked him." The courtroom let out a soft wave of laughter, and even the judge smiled. A few moments later, the papers were signed. The gavel fell. It was official. Henry Blake was now, in every legal and emotional way, Emmy's father. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, and for the first time, the world didn't feel heavy to Kate. She looked at Henry holding Emmy's hand and saw not just a man who had stepped into their lives, but someone who had rebuilt their future without asking for anything in return. Emmy skipped ahead on the sidewalk, shouting that she wanted ice cream and maybe a trip to the park. Henry laughed and said, "Anything for my girl." That night, they celebrated with takeout and music. Emmy danced in the living room in her blue dress while Kate and Henry sat on the couch, watching her with quiet wonder. At one point, Emmy grabbed both their hands and pulled them to the center of the room. "Family dance," she declared. And so they danced, clumsily and laughing, in that small, imperfect living room, under the soft light of a single old lamp. There were no grand speeches, no perfect choreography, just love, messy and real and exactly what they had needed all along. Later, after Emmy was asleep, Kate sat beside Henry on the couch. Her head rested on his shoulder, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, "I never thought we'd get here." Henry kissed the top of her head and replied, "We're just getting started." And for once, Kate believed it without fear. Because sometimes the best endings are actually beginnings in disguise. In my view, the ending of this story is not just heartwarming, it's transformative. What began as an unexpected encounter between a guarded billionaire and a grieving little girl became a journey of healing, love, and redefinition of family. It shows that real strength isn't in power or wealth, but in choosing to show up for someone when they need you most. The final chapters feel earned, not forced. Henry didn't swoop in as a flawless hero, he stumbled, questioned, and changed. Kate, too, had to learn to trust again, to accept love not as a weakness but as something she deserved. And Emmy, in her innocence, became the quiet force that bound them together. This is the kind of ending I love, one that doesn't promise perfection, but something far more valuable, the chance to build a life that's real, imperfect, and full of hope.